Hi everyone. Thanks for joining our Lunch and Learn today on LGBTQ plus grief. My name is Dr. Dan Sheridan. I am a licensed psychologist and the clinical and training advisor for the Children's Bereavement Center. So for this Lunch and Learn, I always like to keep it casual. I invite you all to ask any questions that you might have, any reactions to the content. I have a PowerPoint which we'll go through, but I always like to leave it more discussion. So if there's something comes up that you want to talk about or any scenarios in your personal or professional life that come up that resonate with the content, feel free to shout out. I don't mind being interrupted. You can also write your question or comment in the chat box, and Julissa will be monitoring it for me in case I don't see it. But with that being said, we can get started. So I will share my screen. You're all seeing that correctly?
Seeing the double-sided screen.
A double-sided. Is that better?
Yeah, there you
Okay,
go.
thank you. So the title for today's presentation is Compassionate Support, Understanding and Assisting LGBTQ plus Grievers. So just to give you a rundown of what we'll talk about today, we'll discuss aspects of LGBTQ plus grief, types of losses in the LGBTQ plus community, experiences of LGBTQ plus grief. We'll cover some models of grief that are like the Kubler-Ross model and Worden's tasks of mourning, some established models of grief, and apply that to the LGBTQ plus community. We'll also talk about grief support strategies for LGBTQ plus grievers. And finally, we'll discuss the Children's Bereavement Center, the services we offer, and then leave space at the end for any questions or discussion. So to start off with the introduction, where we'll talk about the unique aspects of LGBTQ plus grief. So grief is a universal human experience. We all go through grieving experiences. It's a normal thing. There's nothing to be ashamed of or feel bad about. We all grieve. But grief is influenced by our identity and the context of our community. So we have to consider who we are and where we live, the environment, the community in which we live and where we grew up. And that brings up the idea of intersectionality, of how grief and identity can intersect. So to give you a brief definition of intersectionality, it's an interconnected nature of social categorizations. That can include race, class, gender, and these can overlap with each other and create interdependent systems of both discrimination and disadvantage. So you can think of it like a kaleidoscope where we all have varying identities that interact and intersect, and it's different for each person. So when we consider a person's grieving experience as an example, we have to consider all of our identities that we bring into a relationship and how we identify. When you apply that to the LGBTQ plus community, grief is often navigated through the lens of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, and other aspects of identity, like socioeconomic status, that can intensify the grieving process. So all of these unique identities that intersect can make grief more profound, more intense, and it can make the grieving process much more challenging for this community. So people who identify with more than one marginalized group can face additional layers of complexity in the grief. So as an example, an LGBTQ plus person of color may have to navigate the grief of losing a partner and also deal with the grief related to racial discrimination and violence. So this layered grief can involve prejudice from their own community, prejudice from their family, and or societal institutions. So there's this additive multiplying component of grief and disenfranchised grief, which we'll talk about later. Intersectionality can also lead to more complex losses. So as an example, consider a gay identifying man who's also an immigrant. He might grieve the loss of a partner while also experiencing grief related to displacement or culture shock. The societal lack of understanding or validation for these losses can make the grief process more challenging. So people might not even consider that as an immigrant, he's dealing with the loss of his homeland where he was born, culture shock, while also grieving a loss of a partner, which may not even be acknowledged either. Intersectionality can also result in unique grief experiences. So a bisexual person with a disability may experience ableism within the LGBTQ plus community or biphobia within the disability community. And this can create feelings of isolation in both communities and a sense of grief for a lack of acceptance in either community or both. Intersectional identities can also sometimes result in limited access to the appropriate grief support. So as an example, a lower income LGBTQ plus individual may have less access to mental health services because of their socioeconomic status. And further, support services that may be available for them may also lack the necessary understanding or training around LGBTQ plus issues and how to create an inclusive, supportive intervention or community, which can lead to inadequate or even harmful responses. So not only do we consider the identity, but we also have to consider a person's community. So within the community context and how that impacts grief, we have to consider societal stigma and how that can limit the ability of LGBTQ plus individuals to publicly mourn their losses, to show their grief, to share it with other people. One thing that's very important is legal recognition. And within the realm of same-sex marriages, as an example, that can provide emotional and practical support in grief, which can include spousal benefits and bereavement leave. Also, LGBTQ plus parents can face unique challenges in grieving the loss of a child because it can create custodial issues after the death of a partner. And that can get very, very complicated for the surviving spouse. Any questions or comments on that before we talk about the types of losses experienced by the queer community? Right? So there's many losses to consider when we're considering the LGBTQ plus community. One, very straightforwardly, is the death of a partner. So this can bring up significant challenges that heterosexual or cisgender people do not have to navigate. One being the exclusion from family mourning rituals. So families of the deceased might not recognize or include the partner in mourning rituals, which can increase feelings of isolation and rejection. And if you think about it, it's a horrible, horrible experience to lose the death of your partner and not be allowed to attend their funeral or to attend the wake or Shiva because they don't consider you part of the family or they don't acknowledge your loss. There's also societal minimization of the loss. So society can downplay the significance of the relationship, say it's not the same, that it's less than a heterosexual relationship. And this brings up the topic of disenfranchised grief, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another type of loss that you can find in the queer community is rejection from family and friends. So doesn't have to do with death, but other types of loss. So you can have a loss of family. So you can experience rejection. Children can be kicked out of the house, leading to homelessness because of them coming out, or a transgender individual transitioning. There could also be loss of friendships. So friends you once had may not accept your identity, and you can lose friendships. But there's another layer of grief to consider. We also can consider the loss of safety or community due to discrimination. So experiences of discrimination, violence, and hostility can occur in various aspects of one life, both at the workplace and the community. So many ways in which a person can experience discrimination. You can also lose safe spaces, and that is happening more and more in schools for the youth. So there's loss of access to communities and environments where they can feel safe and accepted. And this can lead to fear and anxiety. So there's an ongoing fear for one's safety and well-being, and that can lead to increased mental health disparities within the queer community. One other type of loss is the loss of a chosen family member. So a chosen family is groups of individuals who are not biologically related, but provide support, validation, and belongingness. And in the queer community, chosen family members are critical because we don't always have family, our biological family, to lean on, to rely on for support and love. So we create our own families, people who are incredibly special to us. We go to them for help, we go for them for support, celebrations. So the grief from the loss of a chosen family member can be incredibly deep, incredibly profoundly painful, and it can feel just as painful as losing a biological family member. And this is another type of disenfranchised loss that people don't think about. So if someone lost a friend, not only is it just a friend, but it's someone who was considered family. So there's this really significant loss that often isn't considered. There's also the impact of heteronormativity on grief. So heteronormativity is the assumption that heterosexuality is the default sexual orientation. And that is embedded in cultural norms, in laws, social policies, and it marginalizes queer identities. So heteronormativity can lead to the invisibility of queer relationships and identities. It's not considered, it's not recognized, it's not acknowledged. And that can result in societal attitudes that don't recognize or validate the grief of LGBTQ plus individuals. So as an example, a transgender person might face rejection from family who may refuse to recognize their gender identity, and this rejection can complicate the grieving process by adding layers of pain and invalidation. There's also the impact of social recognition on grief. So societal attitudes towards queer relationships can range from full acceptance to outright rejection. And this level of acceptance can significantly impact the availability of support. And as we know, social support is one of the most important predictors of a healthy and helpful grieving experience. We need people when we're grieving. We need support. It's not helpful to grieve alone. So when there are such negative attitudes towards queer individuals, towards queer relationships, that level of support can decrease, resulting in increased isolation and a more complicated grieving process. So without social recognition, queer individuals can face exclusion from community or family support systems, creating further isolation. So one example could be a surviving partner could be denied the right to visit their loved one in the hospital, or a surviving partner may face legal battles over inheritance. We also need to consider one's internalized negative beliefs about their sexual orientation or gender identity and how that can influence one's grief experience. So there are three terms that are often used to describe internalized negative beliefs, and they are internalized homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. And these are the internalizing of negative attitudes, negative beliefs towards one's sexual orientation or one's gender identity. And it can come out in various ways, but the sort of general idea or thought process is that one's sexual orientation or gender identity is wrong, that it's sinful, that there's something to be ashamed of. And these are come from societal messages, societal attitudes, cultural beliefs that are around us. It's heard and then it's taken in as a belief. And this is a very challenging aspect of a mental health struggle that queer individuals often contend with, particularly in the coming out process, forming relationships, self-esteem. So from a clinical perspective, always looking at these internalized negative beliefs is essential in helping someone who identifies in the queer community. So this can also play out with grief. And for LGBTQ plus grievers, they may feel a sense of shame or a sense of guilt for mourning their loss, from the belief that their grief is less valid or justified. So as an example, an individual might feel guilty for mourning a same-sex partner because they have an internalized belief that their relationship was wrong or sinful. that they shouldn't mourn it because they feel like they were doing something wrong to begin with. Another example is a transgender person might struggle with self-acceptance while also grieving family rejection, feeling their identity is to blame for the loss, rather than that their family is ignorant and can't accept them for who they are, but they take it as it's their fault. So there's many ways in which these belief systems can have very powerful effects on the grieving process, and it's something we want to pay attention to. We also want to consider minority stress on grief. So queer individuals experience chronic stress due to their marginalized status in society. And minority stress can happen in all marginalized identities, race, ethnicity being another classic example. And this can come from external stressors and internal stressors related to their stigmatized identity. So externally, that can include discrimination, that can include violence, that can include stigma. For the queer community, internal stressors can be internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and fears of coming out, disclosure and concealment. So there are these stresses that are put upon a queer individual, and these stresses can exacerbate mental health problems and make it hard for a person to find a sense of well-being and a sense of happiness. So when you apply that to grief, the stress from societal discrimination can complicate a grieving process, and that can result in more intense or prolonged grief reactions. Minority stress can also intensify feelings of anxiety, depression, and isolation, which can also complicate a grieving process. So as an example, experiences of violence or threats can compound the emotional toll of grief, leading to increased mental health struggles. Any questions or reactions, comments before we move to models of grief?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, and maybe you're gonna touch upon this later, but one of the things that we've noticed in working with grief or attempting to work with grief with our youth at Safe Schools is that there's an initial um, rejection or the thought of this is not cool to talk about or not fun to talk about, and they tend to not want to get into it, even though it's something that we believe is important for them to talk about, particularly with LGBTQ plus youth that we do serve. So is there a way to better engage youth with this or better talk to them in a much in a different way or a broader way or less serious way, but that can still get the message across?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I have some thoughts, but Julissa and Amanda, do you mind if I punt the question to you? Because I know you've done some trainings with youth recently, and just to share what might have been effective.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Harold, for this question. I'll have Amanda add a little bit more to this too. She's worked a lot more with our kids, with our teenagers. There's always going to be a reluctance for people to speak about grief. It is, I think, acknowledging that is important to even begin the conversation about grief and even have the conversation about why do we not want to talk about it? Why are we reluctant? So starting on that is also very helpful, just for that exploration, internal exploration for a lot of these kids and these individuals are reluctant to talk about it. And also meeting people where they're at, whether it is through different activities, creative means. We usually use a lot of great ways to engage in the conversation of grief that is not just talking, right? There are other strategies that can be used in that sense. Amanda? Anything to add to that?
Amanda might not be there right now. But I was gonna say, it makes me think about just the application of like movies and TV shows. There's like creative ways to talk about grief through like not one's personal grief, but talking about another uh, in this case, like another person's grieving experience through entertainment. And this can sort of lower the pressure of I have to get into something that's might be really painful for me. I am currently grieving. I don't want to get upset or look strange in front of my peers. So it can sort of introduce the idea of open the door of talking about grief without having them to open up and disclose their own personal grieving experience. And we also want to consider the comfort level. You know, people might not know each other in the group, and there might be a hesitation to share. So this is something where if Safe Schools wants to continue to incorporate conversations around grief, that it to give it some time to allow a community and cohesion to form among the youth. And I think through that and the establishing of this is a safe space, and then coming to see that and understand that and believe it, there can be more opportunity to get into these more challenging conversations. Because that's hard. It's hard for any age, but I think for teenagers, it's nobody wants to show they're struggling at that age, and there might be some hesitation to get into it.
Yeah, thank you, because we definitely are planning to continue our Empower Q in-person programming for youth, both in Miami-Dade and Florida. And I'm really pushing to have a grief component into it, but I'm getting a lot of pushback from even from our own facilitators. And
Mm.
I'm trying to I'm trying to be like, guys, I've seen this happen. I've seen it work with the CDC, and I guess since I saw it so well planned out and so, it was running such a well-oiled machine, um, I guess it's not fair for me to expect that it will be like that right away with even with our groups. So yeah, like I know that we did this with during the Heroes Hangout. We tried to get some CBC folks there and it was good, but there was this apprehension even from our own staff to how to integrate it into something that they thought needed to just be fun. And I don't want to just give kids fun. I want to give, kids a well-rounded experience of what it means to be human. And I think grief is so important for that. So
Yeah.
any extra help that we can get from you all, even if there's like a guide that I can give them, will be greatly appreciated. Because particularly for our staff, that the biggest struggle that I've had is with our staff to integrate it.
Yeah.
um the kids they're there, so they're kind of like bound to what we give them. And I saw some of them almost ready, almost willing and ready to open up, but I do hear that it takes time and it takes a continual effort. And I love what you said, Dr. Dan, about the group cohesion. I think that we are planning for that, and maybe this is something that we can incorporate later on in the year, in the program year.
Hmm.
So we'll be in touch that for that.
But Dan, can I just say one thing? Harold, thanks for that question. You said something really important, which is that the adults around aren't comfortable with grief either. And that's really going to impact the students, the kids. So we can talk more, but I really would encourage you to encourage the other staff members to go through our training, our grief informed training series, because it sounds like they need to be grief informed. One of the hardest things for adults is to be comfortable with their own grief when you have teens and kids around them, because if they're not willing to talk about it, I mean, we've heard it ourselves. School counselors will actually say, I'm just uncomfortable talking about grief, so I'm just not going to go talk to that student after they had a loss, which is horrific. Talk about loneliness. So I think for your own team members, that encouragement, Harold, and we welcome you too. I would encourage that.
Yeah, and I'm definitely planning on doing that with our staff. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's such an essential point that it really starts from the top, from the adults. It trickles down to the kids. That if we as the facilitator or the adult can show or mirror a comfort and an ability to go there, it can create that safety and ability for the youth to go there too. Because if the youth start to see the adults are anxious, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, and that's
So,
exactly what happened at one of our locations. That
mhm.
yeah, it was a little messy, but we're learning. So I
Yeah,
appreciate all you all you all do for this, because I know it's important.
No, but it's a great uh example that I think happens in so many other organizations and schools that this is very, very common. So thank you for sharing that example. All right, so let's take a look at some models of grief and how they can be applied to queer individuals. So one of the more classic models of grief that most people know as part of our cultural lexicon are the stages of grief. And the thing about the stages of grief is that they're often misapplied. So when you hear people who are grieving, they're saying, "Oh, I'm going through the stages of grief right now." But that's not necessarily true. Yes, your feelings are valid and they're real, but when we are dealing with a loss, we don't necessarily go through stages like 1 through 5. Grief is very messy. Grief has their ups and downs, their forwards and backwards. It's never a linear process. So the Kubler-Ross model, which is the stages of grief that we all have heard about, really applies to anticipatory grief. So it was originally created for someone who was dealing with their own mortality, that they found out that they were going to die, and they go through these stages. So this gets into the realm of anticipatory grief. So this is the anticipation of grief, of an impending loss. And for queer individuals, anticipatory grief can occur in the process of accepting one's sexual and or gender identity, or the impending death of a close relationship, as two examples. And anticipatory grief can result in prolonged anxiety, emotional turmoil, and it really requires a strong support network. And as we've talked about in the previous sections, finding support in the queer community can be hard. I mean, it happens and it gets done, but there's often less access at a community level, at a society level. So grief support can be more challenging. So I want to just sort of illustrate how these stages of grief can be applied to queer individuals. And I'm going to use an example of coming out because I think it's a really excellent example that can ring true for many queer people. So when you think about the first stage of denial, so denial in the queer context can be refusing to accept the reality of one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And that can serve as a defense mechanism to cope with the fear of societal rejection. So from the outset of identity development in the coming out process, people can often say like, I'm not queer, I'm not gay, I'm not trans, it's just not me. And this is often comes from such a fear, a very understandable and real fear, that I might be rejected, I might experience violence, I might experience discrimination. So a queer individual may deny their sexual orientation or their gender identity to themselves, as well due to internalized homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. There's all these negative beliefs that they don't want to accept about themselves or have to deal with, rather. So there's just blanket denial. Eventually, this can lead to a sense of anger when we go to the next stage. So there can be a frustration and a helplessness when faced with the reality of one's sexual orientation or one's gender identity and the societal challenges it brings. So as it becomes a little bit more real for that person, there can be an anger towards themselves, that they are part of the queer community, and anger towards societal norms and the restrictions and limitations and discriminatory experiences that can happen. There can be anger towards one's family due to lack of acceptance, and anger towards religious institutions, faith communities that they are a part of or were once a part of, for the lack of acceptance that can occur there as well. So when we go on to the next stage, we get into bargaining. So what can often happen is there's an attempt to negotiate or make a deal to either reverse one's sexual orientation or gender identity or lessen the perceived negative consequences of disclosing one's identity. So someone might suppress their identity, not live fully out, sort of broker a deal, or be out in some cases and not out in other situations, or make a deal with a higher power to be accepted or by society or family. And then this can lead to a sense of depression, which can be a sadness or withdrawal due to the realization of potential negative consequences and the difficulty of living authentically. There are many, many barriers to authentic living that a queer individual can face and may have to go through. And this is terribly painful and unfair and it can create a lot of sadness. But eventually, we can get to a place of acceptance where someone can come to terms with one's identity and feel ready to disclose their identity to other people, despite the challenges that may come from it, and find support through this. So coming out is a very complicated process. And if someone you know is in the coming out process, it's so important to be there for them, to show your support, either as an ally or someone within the queer community, because it is such a risk. You never know what's going to happen when you come out. And the people who you thought were 100% there for you may not be there for you ultimately, and may reject you. And it's scary. So if you know somebody who's in the coming out process or recently came out, really know that support is so critical for these individuals. And if you can be there, you're making a huge difference in their lives. So another model of grief that's very popular and something that we teach in the CBC are the tasks of mourning. And this was developed by J. William Worden, who's a psychology professor at Harvard Medical School. And he proposed 4 tasks of mourning as opposed to stages of grief. So the 4 tasks that he proposed were accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain of grief, adjusting to a world without the deceased, and finding a connection to the deceased while moving on. And what's nice about these tasks of mourning as opposed to stages is that they're flexible and they can be approached at any time and in no particular order. So this takes the whole linear progression out of this, and you can think of these as more as check boxes, that you may have to revisit over and over again, which is completely fine and normal, but it allows a lot more flexibility in thinking about one's grief and how to grieve. So in applying this to the queer community, when we look at task 1, which is accepting the reality of the loss, that can involve recognizing the loss and its implications, acknowledging that the deceased is gone and will not return. And for queer grievers, individuals may struggle with acceptance due to societal denial of their relationships. So it may make it harder to accept the loss fully. So due to societal stigma and discrimination, task 1 can maybe get complicated for a queer griever. For task 2, that involves allowing oneself to feel and express the emotions associated with the loss rather than avoiding or suppressing them. So we need to allow ourselves to have our feelings as much as we can, as fully as we can. And for LGBTQ plus grievers, processing this pain of loss might be more difficult if there's a lack of support. They may also fear judgment or invalidation if they show their emotions, if they publicly open up about their loss, which can lead them to suppress their feelings, which can lead to mental health struggles and a more complicated grieving process. For task 3, it involves adapting to life without the deceased, finding new roles and routines to cope with the absence. For queer grievers, adjustment can be challenging if the individual faces discrimination or loss of community. So the need to find support systems and routines can be hindered by societal barriers. And finally, we have task 4, which is finding and enduring connection while moving on. So this involves maintaining a bond with the deceased, which we call continuing bonds, while also continuing to live, to have your own life, to keep embracing life and keeping their memories alive. So for queer grievers, rituals and memorials that acknowledge the relationship and the deceased identity are essential. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about more support strategies and what that could look like. So finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have disenfranchised grief, which is such a critical thing to consider for the queer community. And it happens in other types of losses as well. One at the top of my mind right now is perinatal and infant losses, another disenfranchised loss. But disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that's not openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly mourned. So it's not recognized the way other losses are recognized. And this can happen because the loss is stigmatized, the relationship is not recognized by society, or the griever is not seen as a legitimate mourner. So for LGBTQ plus individuals, There's a frequent experience of disenfranchised grief due to societal stigma, the marginalization of their relationships and identities, cultural norms, religious beliefs, and legal barriers. And when we have disenfranchised grief, it can lead to isolation due to a lack of support, a sense of shame for their loss and their feelings, which can prolong the mourning and grieving process and lead to some complications in grieving and mental health struggles. So there's various types of disenfranchised grief that we can consider for the queer community. One is relationship-based. So relationships that don't conform to heteronormative standards, such as same-sex partnerships or polyamorous relationships or other non-traditional relationships, can all be disenfranchised. And the grieving individual may not be allowed to participate in the partner's funeral arrangements because the relationship is not recognized by the deceased family, as we mentioned earlier. There's also an identity-based disenfranchised grief. So that can include the grief related to the rejection or non-acceptance of an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. So as an example, a transgender person may mourn the loss of their previous identity while facing rejection from their family at the same time. There's also a social and cultural disenfranchised grief. So these are grief experiences that are invalidated by societal attitudes and cultural norms. So a queer individual may grieve the loss of a supportive community, such as a faith community, as an example, due to the exclusion or rejection, and be unrecognized by the broader society. So none of this gets talked about. None of this is considered as something that someone might actually have to grieve. It's very, for heterosexual people, the thought of being kicked out of a faith community is inconceivable, arguably. So if someone feels like they're no longer welcome there or they cannot attend, it's a horrible loss of community that may have been so important and central to their lives, and it never gets acknowledged. There's also invisible losses. So this is grief over intangible or non-physical losses, such as the loss of a future, loss of dreams, safety, and acceptance. So a queer individual can grieve the loss of a safe environment that they once had, or the ability to openly express one's identity. And that's another thing that can be overlooked, unconsidered, or invalidated. Any questions or comments about models of grief? Okay. So now we'll move on to support strategies. So how can we support LGBTQ plus grievers in their grief process? First and foremost, one of the most important things we can do is be a really good listener. And that's essential to being a good supportive person. So when we provide effective support, we're good listeners. So active listening is key. And that is fully concentrating, understanding, responding, and remember what the speaker's saying. We want to be present in the moment with the person. We want to be engaged in the conversation without any distractions. Active listening also involves empathy, which is recognizing and validating the emotions and experiences of others. And there's several techniques we can do and employ to show that we're actively listening. The first is eye contact. So we want to look at them when they're talking. We can also nod our head, and which are nonverbal, which can include our body language, how we're holding our body, presenting our body to the person. And there can be verbal acknowledgements, and these can be small things like saying, uh-huh, mm-hmm, I see, tell me more about that. And then there's reflective listening. Reflective listening involves identifying the emotions that the person's talking about, and reflecting them back. So you could say, it sounds like you're really sad right now, or it sounds like you're feeling so scared that you don't have any support system right now. So you want to, through listening, we can hear feelings, and we want to reflect the feelings back, and that shows we're listening. There's also paraphrasing and summarizing, which is condensing what the person's saying into a more concise way and giving it back to them, letting them know that you are hearing them, you're understanding what they're saying. And these are opportunities to check in, to make sure you're hearing them correctly. And if you're not, if you misunderstood, it's an opportunity to correct it and show that you want to know, you want to hear what they have to say. Active listening also entails avoiding interruptions. So we want to put our cell phone away. We don't want to look at our watch or the clock. We want to give our undivided attention to the person as much as we can. And that can take practice. It's not always easy to do that. There's also emotional validation, which is empathy. So really showing that we accept, that we understand their feeling experience as valid, as real. We want to express our understanding, and we want to offer our support as best we can. How can I be here for you? What do you need from me? How can I be a support to you? And for every person that might be different. So we want to really take it out as a individualized person-to-person approach. We also want to avoid assumptions and respect a person's pronouns. So we want to avoid making presumptions about an individual's experiences, their relationships, or their identity. Period. That's for everyone. But for queer individuals, that can include avoiding assumption about a person's sexual orientation or gender identity based on their appearance, like how they look, or stereotypes about the queer community or what a gay person is supposed to be like. These are all not true necessarily. So we want to be flexible and meet the person where they're at and see them for who they are. We also very importantly not want to assume that someone's partner is of the opposite sex. So language is very important here. So we want to be careful about saying like boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, if we don't know. So it's more, what's safer is to say, partner, significant other, if you don't know. And then you can ask more clarifying questions about what was the relationship of the person who passed away, and just follow their language, follow their lead. There's also pronouns that we want to be mindful and attentive to. So, and that really shows respect and inclusion. So how we incorporate pronouns can be asking a person's pronouns. So you can ask them what their pronouns are, and people are often happy to answer. And we want to use the correct pronouns consistently. And some people, this may be very new for you, which is totally fine. So at times we may make mistakes, and it does happen. But if you do notice you make a mistake, the best thing you can do is to correct it and to apologize. And we all know that we're all understanding that there's a learning process, there's a learning curve for some people, but showing that you are interested and dedicated to using the right pronouns really makes a big difference. And an apology goes a long way. So if you don't apologize, it can communicate a sense of apathy, indifference. So always just, if you make a mistake, correct it and apologize. Another supportive strategy is creating safe and inclusive environments. So this gets back to the topic of safe spaces. And these are places where individuals can feel secure, accepted, and free to express themselves without fear of judgment or discrimination. And that is essential for grief support. We don't want in any grief support environment, we want people to be able to express themselves freely. We want them to be accepted for who they are, and we don't want them to feel judged or discriminated against. So how we communicate a safe space is inclusivity, that all identities are welcome. There's a confidentiality, that what we say here is safe here. We're not going to share it outside of the room. And that there's a non-judgmental attitude for a person's identity or how they express their grief. And a safe space can allow for effective peer support. And this can reduce feelings of isolation and increase emotional validation and understanding, which are essential parts of helping someone who's grieving. There are also various coping strategies that we can help employ. And coping strategies are unique. Everyone copes in a different way, but here are some examples that can be applied to queer individuals who are grieving. One is helping them to seek support from those who validate their loss. So this can be potentially family and friends who knew about the relationship with the person who died, and having them listen empathetically without minimizing or denying feelings. We can also create memory books or digital memories. So a person can create a physical memory book, like a photo album or digital memory album on Facebook as an example, or they can create a memorial website, and which can include photos, stories, and messages from friends and loved ones, which can be another creative way of expressing one's grief as well. There's also community service and activism. So participating in a community service project or advocacy work that aligns with the loved one's passions or values can serve as a living memorial to their spirit. So as an example, if your loved one was passionate about LGBTQ plus rights, you can volunteer at an LGBTQ plus community center or advocacy group. There's also artistic expression, and our support groups love artistic expression and employ music therapists and art therapists, which we'll share a little bit more about shortly about our support groups. But any artistic expression, which can include art, music, dance, painting, poetry, writing, can be a very therapeutic outlet for expressing grief, and it can give form to complex emotions surrounding loss that we may not have the words for. But through art, we can find a way to express ourselves in a way that feels very authentic to what we're feeling in that moment. We also may need to create our own morning ritual. So we may have to get creative. So for those who are unable to participate in traditional morning rituals with family or friends due to an unacknowledged or unaccepted loss, engaging in your own morning ritual can provide a healing, grieving experience. And this can be various ways. But some examples could be writing a letter to say goodbye, hosting a dinner party where people bring your loved one's favorite foods, or holding a memorial service in a place that holds special significance to you and your loved one. So it doesn't have to necessarily be in a faith institution like a church or synagogue, but it can be a very particular spot that held a lot of significance to you and your loved one. There's also always professional help. So we want, there's therapists and counselors that can be available to help someone who's grieving, but we want to make sure that they have specialty and experience with queer issues in the grieving process as well, to helping them find personal meaning in their loss and navigate their grief in validating and supportive ways. And finally, there are grief support groups. So a grief support group can provide a space to share your experiences and feelings with others who understand the unique challenges of grief. It's very special to be around other people who are going through a similar situation and can say, you know, you're not crazy. I went through that yesterday, or I understand. Even though your experience is different, I have an understanding of what you're feeling right now. And that's incredibly validating and empowering to learn from others' experiences while also receiving help from a supportive community. And these are people who can eventually become friends if you really connect with some people in the group. So any questions or comments before I talk a little bit more about the CBC and how we can be a support for you all?
Dan, back to Harold's point before, is there anything different that you would recommend for teens versus younger kids versus adults in these different strategies you're talking about?
It's a good question. I have to think about that. Let me go back. I think at the top of my mind is just, I mean, you're talking about developmental stages. So if there's any intervention you're providing, particularly like an activity, we want to make it developmentally appropriate to meet so the activity is framed for where the person's age. So if they're younger, it can be more simple things. It can be just learning to identify feelings and emotional regulation. And as they get older, it can be more complex things about grief and loss and prompts that get to more nuanced areas of grief. But I think of the things I listed, nothing comes to mind at the moment. Anything else?
I do appreciate how you mentioned a lot of the digital components to all this.
Mhm.
Because I mean, even with me, you know, I recently lost my childhood dog, and Google Memories is constantly putting Kira up into my feed. I doesn't know that I lost her, but um, there are days that I love it, and then there are days that I kind of don't like it. Like it just brings me back to that moment of grief. So I think that's, Facebook has my Facebook memories. There's all these other things that continue to remind us of the past, and there's no way for these programs to know um, how that affects the user, and that that could be very problematic, I think.
I think that's a great point. It's almost like, I don't know the right word, but if there was some feature you could just let Google or Facebook know, like, hey, this person passed away, like somehow to like navigate the memories. Because you're right, it can be invasive at times if you're not ready, or it can catch you off guard. It can reopen things at not the right time.
Yeah, we hear that a lot in groups, that people will say that, because your iPhone will do it, and it's all the social media platforms do that, Shutterfly. So it is something, Harold, that, yeah, and I can relate to. And my dog died. It's my dog died 4 years ago, and I'm still getting things from like Chewy for him for happy birthday. And I really need to go on because it's just like, oh my goodness, this is such a lot. So, but certainly with our human loved ones, it's very difficult when it comes up, and in groups, it often is discussed.
But that's also like a way to help these individuals, right? Like there's so much that you have to um, change and update, uh, places that you need to say, this person is has died, and so perhaps that's a way to support grieving individuals. I can help you with that, as much as possible. I can help you with, we have a lot of older grievers that may not understand technology and how to turn off those things. I can help you with that. Um, Help you with
Yeah.
that social media cleanse. That's part of that process. So I think it's really great. Dan, you also mentioned like, oh, you're talking about the coping strategies, but I wonder if there are some sort of negative coping mechanisms specifically that you observe more in the LGBTQ plus community that you feel for those who want to support those grieving individuals. How can we be more aware of that?
One that is at top of mind for me is substance use. Alcohol use is an often overutilized coping strategy that can have, of course, very harmful effects. There's a lot of emotional numbing that can occur, and it's not just for the LGBTQ plus community, but it does happen, I think, at higher rates. So if you do notice a friend or family member in the LGBTQ plus community who is drinking more or engaging in substances, it's something to keep aware of, and to help them, ask them if they need help, how you can help them. You can guide them to other more healthy resources like a support group, the CBC support groups, or, exercise. I mean, there's many other healthy coping mechanisms, but alcohol use and drug use can be quite prevalent and problematic.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, like uh, the substance abuse and drug abuse is already high among LGBTQ plus folk because of the trauma of that we incur from what Dan mentioned, places of worship, our own houses, school, wherever it comes from. So when something major happens, like a death, that just exacerbates that and makes it even worse, and it almost like re-traumatizes the individual throughout the entirety of the life, because you never know what the person that died, how they affected them in the history of their lives. Um, something to be, something to also be aware of when it comes to grieving the LGBTQ community.
Yep. I would also, one other thing, I mean, just in terms of disparity level, is just unprotected sex. There's can be also risky sexual behaviors that can be used from a place of just trying to self-soothe and emotionally numb. So that's just another thing to consider for the queer community.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the Children's Grievance Center and how we can be a resource for you all. So the CBC, if you're not familiar with us, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we provide free grief support groups for all ages, starting as young as 4 years old. We also have Lift from Loss, which is a division of CBC that provides support for young adults and adults. We were founded in 1999, so we've been around for 25 years now. And our clinical team includes national grief experts, thanatologists, which are experts in the study of death and dying, and our group facilitators are mental health professionals. We do service Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, as well as nationally. So we do reach all areas of the United States now that we are virtual. And we do offer free resource articles, which are available to the community. So if you go to our website, childbereavement.org, and look at our resource page, you'll see a bunch of PDFs that are available for download or sharing. And they're great grief topics that can be of use to either yourself, if you're personally going through a loss, or you know someone who's grieving. Give you all just an idea about how we approach grief, and we'll talk about our beliefs. So for us, grief is a natural, healthy reaction to loss. There's nothing wrong with grieving. It's a normal thing. So we want to help you to grieve in a healthy way. We want to take away any shame or stigma you have about your grief and help you feel comfortable opening up. We also believe that everyone has the capacity to heal. So something very, very tragic, very traumatic may have happened to you, but we hold the position that you can heal from this loss. Your life is not ruined. You are not broken. You can find a way to heal from this experience. We also believe that everyone grieves differently. It looks different. It lasts a different amount of time. So we want to help you find your own unique way of grieving. We're never going to tell you that you've taken too long, you need to get over it, you need to move on. We want to give you the time, the space, and the flexibility to have your grief in your own unique way. And we want to honor that and respect that. We also believe that relationships continue after the person has died. So we never say you need to let them go, you need to get over it. We want to help you maintain a relationship with this person, even though they're no longer physically here. And that can look very different depending on the person and the relationship you had. But for some, that can be through writing, through art, through music, through dance, whatever that looks like. We want to help you find it and foster that. We also believe in the power of social support in grief. So this is essentially why we provide grief support groups. It's not helpful to grieve alone. We don't want you to grieve alone. We want to provide a space each week where you can have a connection and community in your grief and never be alone with your feelings. And finally, we believe that grief is transformative and can lead to positive growth. So although something really tragic had happened, you can grow from this experience. You can find strengths you never knew you had. And so we want to help you find those strengths, to help you grow in positive ways, and to learn about yourself in this grieving experience. Grief can teach you a lot about yourself. You can realize things you never knew you were capable of. So even though you may not be able to see that, we have a group of other people who can see the change, who can see your strengths. And we want to bring that to the forefront of the conversation and help you see what you bring to the table in your own growth. This backpack full of rocks is here intentional, and we use it as a metaphor for the grieving experience and how our grief support groups can be effective. So for us, we say going through a loss, going through a death is like getting a backpack full of rocks. It's heavy, it's uncomfortable. Nobody wants a backpack full of rocks, but it's what you got right now. But by coming to a grief support group, it's an opportunity to take off that backpack and to begin to look at those rocks in there. And you can say to yourself each week, do I want to hold on to this rock for another week, or do I want to let this one go? And the idea is that over time, the more you attend a support group, the more you come to open up about your grief and connect with other people, you're going to be more willing, more able to let go of those rocks. where eventually your backpack is going to be much lighter. Your grief is not going to feel as heavy anymore. We can never take that backpack away. We can never take your loss away, but we can help you live with your loss in a way that's much more comfortable, much more doable than it was in the beginning. To provide you all some more just detailed information about our support groups, as I mentioned, they're free of cost. We never charge for our support groups, so they're free to attend, and we start as young as 4 years old. They are open to anyone who's lost a loved one as a result of illness, accident, suicide, homicide, any loss due to death. You are welcome to participate in our grief support groups. Our groups are also age appropriate. So we have groups for children and teens. So we have elementary school groups. We have groups for kindergarten to second grade, from third grade to fifth grade. We also have middle school groups and high school groups. For adults, we have a young adults group, adult groups in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. We also have a dedicated child loss group in English, Spanish coming soon. And we also have a perinatal and infant loss group in English and Spanish. So we have a lot of developmentally appropriate and available groups if anything resonates with you all. Our groups are co-facilitated, so we have at a minimum 2 facilitators in each group, and one is a licensed mental health professional, and the other is a trained volunteer trained by the Children's Bereavement Center. As I mentioned earlier, we love art and music, so we do include art and music therapists in our support groups. So there are activities that our attendees, our participants do during the grief support groups. And we also hold candle lighting ceremonies, which we call Connect and Remember events. And there's one coming up soon, right, Julissa? I think when is it, Saturday? Saturday, yeah.
Yes, it's this Saturday. So it's going to be a great event. It is in Florida City. We're going to have a lot of great activities for families and some amazing giveaways as well.
Okay, wonderful. And just importantly, our grief support groups are not group therapy. So we don't provide therapy, but we do believe our groups are therapeutic. So if there's anyone who's concerned that they're going to group therapy, we're not that. We are strictly a support group, and we are here to support each other and help each other through our grief and loss. Our groups are consistent and open-ended, so they occur at the same time each week. So we always try to be consistent and predictable. So we don't change the day on you. We don't change the time on you. We do run year-round, so we do meet over the summer. We have a 12-month program. We also don't have a curriculum. So we don't tell you what we're going to talk about each night. We don't have preset topics. We allow our participants to talk about anything that's on their mind. They start the conversation, and we follow the participants. So we want to meet you where you're at in your grief. Our groups are also accessible. So they occur online through Zoom. So all of our groups are virtual. As I said, they're free to participate. There's no cost. There's also no wait list. So one of the best things about Zoom is that when one group gets too full, we can start another group right away. So we'll never turn you away because we're too full. We always have the capacity to welcome new participants at any time. We also encourage and recommend that the whole family participate in our grief support groups. For us, grief is not the child's problem. Grief is not the parent or caregiver's problem. Grief is a family problem. The family is going through this loss together, and they need to heal together. So we encourage every family member, regardless of age, to participate in our grief support groups, and everyone gets their own dedicated group based on their age. The loss can, it doesn't matter when the loss occurred. It could be 5 days ago or 5 years ago. So whenever you've experienced a loss, you are welcome into our grief support groups, and there are no limits to how often you can attend. You can attend for once, or you can attend for a year or 2 years. We are here to meet you where you're at, and you can also stop and return in the future if you'd like. So we're very welcoming in that regard. Our groups are also inclusive, so we welcome anyone touched by the loss of a loved one. It doesn't have to be a family member, direct family, biological family member. It can be a chosen family member. It can be a friend. It can be a neighbor. It can be a teacher. If you are grieving the loss of someone who's died, you can join our grief support groups. Our groups are also non-denominational, they're culturally diverse, and we welcome all identities, including the LGBTQ plus community. If you or someone you know is interested in joining a grief support group, it's a 3-step process. We try to keep it quick and easy. First step is to call our number 888-988-5438, or you can email support@childbereavement.org or fill out our website form. You will be connected to one of our intake coordinators who will get some basic demographic information, figure out scheduling to find the night that works best for you or your family. So you'll register with our intake staff. You'll speak to one of our group coordinators based on your schedule, the night you choose, and they'll welcome you to the group, and then you can join. So if possible, if we have the availability, you could join that night, that day, if you'd like, or that week. But we try to get you in as quickly as possible. There is no referral required. You don't need a doctor's note. You don't need a therapist's note. You can enroll on your own whenever you're ready. You just call us or email us or fill out our website form on childbereavement.org. If anybody is interested in our community events, we have a few that occur throughout the year. One is our Lunch and Learns, which we're doing right now. These are quarterly on Zoom, and we bring in grief experts throughout the country to talk about a specific topic. And if something is of interest to you that you'd like to learn more about, you're welcome to email us, and we'll find a speaker who can present on this for you all. We also hold conversations with the CBC, which are Q&As that address grief-related topics, and those are held quarterly on Zoom. We also have pop-up events in the community to learn about our services and enjoy grief-related activities, and these are hosted throughout South Florida. And our signature event is Steps for Healing, which is occurring at Zoom Miami on November 23rd. So if you're interested in doing a 5K run or walk, you are welcome to join us. Check out stepsforhealing.org where you can register. And not only do you get to participate in a 5K, but you get a ticket to the zoo as well. So it could be a fun day for you and your family. Finally, if you'd like to follow us on social media, you can. Our handle is @MiamiCBC. And at the bottom of the page is our phone number, our general info email address, and our website, childbereavement.org. So that wraps up the presentation. I can open it up for any final questions or general discussion that you all may have.
I don't see any additional questions. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here, presenting on this. I want to remind everybody that this is sort of a continuation of our LGBTQ series. We have another training before this one that I encourage you to watch. It's also amazing. So we will have these online for you to view. And as always, we're available if you have any questions. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.